He thought also that a settlement in his neighborhood would disclose new sources of trade and open a more direct communication with China and the British possessions in the East Indies than the Old World afforded by the Cape of Good Hope. He was baffled, however, in his attempt to cross the mountains. In point of time, the next important expedition in the northern portion of America was that of Samuel Hearne, who, with the object of discovering copper mines, pushed northwestwardly during the years 1769, 70, 71, and 72, from the Prince of Wales fort in Hudson's Bay as far as the shores of the Arctic Ocean. We have, after this, to record a second attempt of Captain Carver's, which was set on foot in 1774, in which he was joined by Richard Whitworth, a member of Parliament and a man of wealth. We only noticed this enterprise on account of the extensive scale on which it was projected, for in fact it was never carried into execution. The gentlemen were to take with them 50 or 60 men, artificers and mariners, and with these make their way up one of the branches of the Missouri, explore the mountains for the source of the Oregon, and sail down that river to the supposed mouth near the Straits of Anian. Here a fort was to be built, as well as vessels for the purpose of farther discovery. The undertaking was stopped by the breakout of the American Revolution. As early as 1775, the fur trade had been carried by the Canadian missionaries north and west to the banks of the Saskatchewan River. In 1553 north latitude, 102 west longitude, and in the beginning of 1776, Mr. Joseph Frobisher proceeded in this direction as far as 55 north and 103 west. In 1778, Mr. Peter Bond, with 4 canoes, pushed onto the Elk River about 30 miles south of its junction with the Lake of the Hills. We have now to mention another attempt, which was baffled at in its very outset, to cross the broadest portion of the continent from ocean to ocean. This attempt is scarcely known by the public to have been made at all, and is mentioned by Mr. Jefferson alone, and by him only in a cursory way. Mr. J. relates that the Ledyard called upon him in Paris, panting for some new enterprise, after his successful voyage from Captain Cook, and that he, Mr. J., proposed to him that he should go by land to Kamchatka, crossing some of the Russian vessels to Nootka Sound, fall down in the latitude of Missouri, and then striking through the country, pass down that river into the United States. Ledyard agreed to the proposal, provided the permission of the Russian government could be obtained. Mr. Jefferson succeeded in obtaining this, and the traveler, setting out from Paris, arrived at St. Petersburg after the Empress had left that place to pass the winter at Moscow. His finances were not permitting him to make an unnecessary stay at St. P. He continued on his route with a passport from one of the ministers, and at 200 miles from Kamchatka, was arrested by an officer of the Empress, who had changed her mind and now forbade his proceeding. He was put into close carriage and driven by day and night without stopping till he finally reached Poland, where he was set down and dismissed. Mr. Jefferson, speaking of the Ledyard's undertaking, erroneously calls it the first attempt to explore the western part of our northern continent. The next enterprise of moment was the remarkable one of Sir Alexander Mackenzie, which was prosecuted in 1789. He started from Montreal, pushed through the Outaouais River, Lake Nipissing, Lake Huron, around the northern shore of Lake Superior, through what is called the Grand Portage, thence along Rain River, the Lake of the Woods, Bonnock Lake, the upper part of Doghead Lake, the south coast of Lake Winnipeg, through Cedar Lake and past the mouth of the Saskatchewan to Sturgeon Lake, thence again by portage to the Mississippi, and through Black Bear, Primos, and the Buffalo Lakes, to a range of high mountains running northeast and southwest, then taking Elk River to the Lake of the Hills, then passing through Slave River into Slave Lake, around the northern shore of this latter to Mackenzie's River, and down this lastly to the Polar Sea. An immense journey, during which he encountered dangers innumerable, and hardships of the severest kind. In the whole of his course down Mackenzie's River to its embouchure, he passed along the bottom of the eastern declivity of the Rocky Mountains, but never crossed those barriers. In the spring of 1793, however, starting from Montreal and pursuing the route of his first journeys as far as the mouth of the Onondaga or Peace River, he then turned off the westward up the stream, pushed through the mountains in latitude 56, then proceeded to the south until he struck a river which he called the Salmon, now Fraser's. And following this, finally reached the Pacific in about the 40th parallel north latitude. The memorable expedition of the Captains Lewis and Clark was in progress during the years 1804, 5, and 6. In 1803, the act of establishing trade houses with the Indian tribes being about to expire, some modifications of it, with an extension of its views to the Indians on the Missouri, were recommended to Congress by a confidential message from Mr. Jefferson of January 18th. In order to prepare the way, it was proposed to send a party to trace the Missouri to its source, cross the Rocky Mountains, and follow the best water communications, which offered itself thence to the Pacific Ocean. This design was fully carried out, Captain Lewis exploring, but not first discovering, as Mr. Irving relates, the upper waters of the Columbia River and following the course of that stream to its embouchure. The headwaters of the Columbia were visited by Mackenzie as early as 1793. Coincident with the exploring tour of Lewis and Clark up the Missouri was that of Major Zebulon M. Pike up the Mississippi, which he succeeded in tracing to its source in Tosco Lake. Upon his return from this voyage, he penetrated by the orders of government from the Mississippi westwardly during the years 1805, 6, and 7 to the headwaters of the Arkansas beyond the Rocky Mountains in latitude 40 north, passing along the Osage and Kansas rivers, and to the source of the Platte. In 1810, Mr. David Thompson, a partner of the Northwest Fur Company, set out from Montreal with a strong company to cross the continent to the Pacific. The first part of this route was that of Mackenzie in 1793. The object was to anticipate a design of Mr. John Jacob Astor's, to wit, the establishment of a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia. Most of his people deserted him on the eastern side of the mountains, but he finally succeeded in crossing the chain with only 8 followers when he struck the northern branch of the Columbia and descended that river from a point much nearer its source than from any white man had done before. In 1811, Mr. Astor's own remarkable enterprise was carried into effect, at least as far as the journey across the country was concerned. As Mr. Irving had already made all the readers well acquainted with the particulars of this journey, we need only mention it in brief. The design in which we have just spoken of the track of the party under command of Mr. Wilson Price Hunt was from Montreal up the Outaouais through Lake Nipissing and a succession of small lakes and rivers to Michilimackinac, or Mackinac, thence by Green Bay, Fox and Wisconsin rivers to the Prairie du Chien, thence down the Mississippi to St. Louis, thence up the Missouri to the village of the Iroquois Araucarian Indians. Between the 46 and 47 parallels of north latitude and 1,430 miles above the mouth of the river, thence bending to the southwest across the river, across the desert, over the mountains about where the headwaters of the Platte and Yellowstone take rise, and along the south branch of the Columbia to the sea. Two small return parties from this expedition made most perilous and eventful passages across the country. The travels of Major Stephen H. Long are the next most important in point of time. This gentleman in 1823 proceeded the source of St. Peter's River to Lake Winnipeg, to the Lake of the Woods, etc., etc. Of the more recent journeys of Captain Bonneville and others, it is scarcely necessary to speak, as they will dwell in the public memory. Captain B's adventures have been well related by Mr. Irving. In 1832, he passed from Fort Osage across the Rocky Mountains and spent nearly 3 years in the regions beyond. Within the limits of the United States, there is very little ground which has not, of late years, been traversed by the man of science or the adventurer. But in those wide and desolate regions which lie north of our territory, and to the westward of Mackenzie's River, the foot of no civilized man, with the exception of Mr. Rodman and his very small party, has ever been known to tread. In regard to the question of the first passage across the Rocky Mountains, it will be seen, from what we have already said, that the credit of the enterprise should never have been given to Lewis and Clark, since Mackenzie had succeeded in it in the year 1793, and that, in point of fact, Mr. Rodman was the first who overcame these gigantic barriers, crossing them as he did in 1792. Thus, it is not without good reason that we claim public attention for the extraordinary narrative which ensues. Signed, Editors, G.M.